Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
The cul-de-sac court. The rhythmic squeal of Michael's chair punctuated the still afternoon, a metronomic counterpoint to the silence of the cul-de-sac. Sunlight blazed, turning the asphalt pliable under the summer heat. Perspiration trickled, a salty film clouding his vision as he worked the ball, the familiar orange sphere a well-worn extension of his hands. A pivot, the chair an intrinsic part of him, and a launch. The ball climbed in a graceful arc against the cerulean canvas, only to carom harshly off the iron. Damn, he grumbled, propelling himself to retrieve it. Each failed attempt chipped at his resolve, a subtle chorus of doubt. Yet a stronger force surged within, a burning desire to excel that drowned out the negativity. Officially Robin Wood Court, the cul-de-sac was a testament to conformity, from the precisely trimmed lawns to the artfully arranged rose bushes. Typically tranquility reigned. Mrs. Henderson fussed over her prized petunias. Mr. Abernathy lavished attention on his classic Mustang. The Garcia twins perfected their aquatic ballet in the backyard pool. Michael, perhaps, was the sole anomaly. He dribbled, the ball a percussive thud against the blacktop. He conjured Coach Miller's image, his gravelly voice dispensing advice, urging him onward. Drive harder, Rodriguez, engage your core. He summoned that phantom energy, pushing through the ache in his muscles. Another shot, another miss. He sought refuge in the meager shadow cast by the oak at the edge of his driveway, reaching for his water bottle. The cool liquid was a momentary reprieve. He eyed the hoop, its chain net swaying in the gentle breeze. His domain, his sanctuary, his proving ground. Earning a place on the regional team meant everything. It was a chance to demonstrate, perhaps to the world, that the accident wasn't his defining characteristic. He was still Michael Rodriguez, the athlete, not just Michael Rodriguez, confined to a wheelchair. He noticed Mrs. Henderson's surreptitious peek from behind her drapes. It was a ritual. A fleeting, covert glance, ensuring he wasn't disrupting the peace. He offered a brief wave, which she promptly ignored, retreating into her home. He exhaled a sigh of resignation. He knew he stood apart. He knew his practice likely amplified the quiet, but what were his options? To sequester himself, succumbing to self-pity? No, he possessed a goal. A driving ambition, and he wouldn't allow anything, or anyone, to hinder him. He recalled his introduction to wheelchair basketball. A therapist at the rehabilitation center had suggested it, almost as a trivial afterthought. He'd been apprehensive, unsure, but the instant he'd settled into the chair, felt the power and control. Something had resonated within him. He wasn't merely moving, he was competing star. He was alive. A sleek, ebony SUV glided into the cul-de-sac. Brenda Morrison, the HOA president. A knot tightened in Michael's stomach. They'd clashed before, over the decibel levels, and potential property degradation. He prepared himself. Brenda emerged from the vehicle, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose. Her gaze swept across the scene, a practiced assessment, pausing on Michael. He felt the weight of her disapproval, a palpable force. She straightened, smoothing her tailored jacket. Michael, she began, her tone clipped and precise, we need a word. He inhaled deeply, bracing for the inevitable reprimand. About what? He inquired, the answer already clear. The basketball, she stated, gesturing towards the hoop with a perfectly sculpted hand. It's disruptive and quite frankly, it clashes with the neighborhood's atmosphere. He propelled himself forward, meeting her gaze directly. I'm training, he responded, his voice steady despite the tremor within. I'm vying for a spot on the regional team. Brenda's face remained impassive. I understand that, Michael, but this is a residential area. We operate under specific guidelines. Guidelines prohibiting basketball practice, he challenged, a spark of indignation flaring within. Guidelines concerning noise, property values, upholding community standards, she retorted, her voice taking on a sharper edge. And your activities are in violation of several of them. He surveyed the cul-de-sac, the immaculate lawns, the uniformly positioned mailboxes, the oppressive serenity. It was a gilded cage, and he felt a sudden, desperate urge for liberation. So, what do you expect me to do? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Give up or abandon my aspirations? Brenda hesitated, her expression inscrutable behind her shaded lenses. I'm merely suggesting, she offered, her tone mellowing slightly, that perhaps you could identify a more appropriate venue for your practice. Michael regarded her, the significance of her words weighing heavily upon him. The cul-de-sac was his court, his training ground. his refuge, and she was threatening to deprive him of it all rules and regulations. Brenda Abernathy's pruning shears clicked with the precision of a Swiss watch. Each snip was a small victory against the creeping chaos of nature, a testament to her unwavering commitment to order. Her meticulously manicured lawn, a vibrant emerald green, was the envy of Willow Creek Estates, and Brenda intended to keep it that way. She straightened, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her gardening glove, and surveyed her domain. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's petunias were looking decidedly droopy. A mental note was made further down. Young Timmy Miller's basketball hoop was, as usual, askew. Brenda sighed. Slackness was a virus, and she was determined to be the antivirus. Then she saw him, Michael Rodriguez. He was in the cul-de-sac, a whirlwind of motion in his sports wheelchair, the squeak of rubber on asphalt, the rhythmic thump of the basketball, the grunts of exertion. All of it assaulted Brenda's carefully curated tranquility. He was dribbling, spinning, shooting at a makeshift hoop attached to a lamppost. The lamppost, that was town property. Brenda's lips thinned. This was precisely the sort of thing the HOA was designed to prevent: unapproved sporting activities, noise pollution, obstruction of public thoroughfares. The list went on. She marched towards the edge of her property, her gardening shears still clutched in her hand, a weapon against disorder. He missed a shot, and the ball bounced, rolling dangerously close to her meticulously arranged rows. "Bushes, excuse me," she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. Michael stopped, breathing heavily, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at her, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Hey, I'm sorry. I'll get it." He wheeled quickly towards the ball, retrieving it before it could inflict any damage on Brenda's prize-winning piece. "Rose, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Brenda demanded, her voice tight. Michael hesitated, bouncing the ball once. "Just practicing. I'm trying out for the regional team." "Practicing? In the middle of the cul-de-sac? Don't you have a park, a gymnasium, someplace it's appropriate?" Brenda gestured vaguely, encompassing the whole neighborhood in her disapproval. He shrugged, his face clouding over. "The park's got gravel, and the gym is always booked. This is the only place I can." He trailed off. Brenda's gaze hardened. She wasn't unsympathetic, not exactly, but rules were rules. Empathy was a slippery slope that led to chaos. "Well, it's disruptive, and I'm quite sure it's against several HOA regulations." Michael's shoulders slumped. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I try to keep it down." "Trying isn't enough," Brenda retorted, turning back towards her house. "I'll be checking the HOA guidelines, and I suggest you find another location for your practice." She punctuated her statement with a curt nod and marched back inside, the squeak of her sensible gardening shoes echoing on the pristine sidewalk. Inside, Brenda headed straight for her meticulously organized office. The HOA rulebook resided on the top shelf, a thick, reassuring volume bound in navy blue. She retrieved it, the weight familiar and comforting in her hands. Flipping through the pages, she ran her finger down the index: noise complaints, obstruction of right-of-way, use of common areas, prohibited activities. Each section was meticulously highlighted, underlined, and annotated with her own precise notes. She paused at section 4.2b, noise levels shall not exceed 50 decibels between the hours of 9 a.m. and 7 p.m., and 40 decibels between the hours of 7 p.m. and 9:00 a.m. Repeated noise disturbances will result in a fine. Her eyes gleamed. The rhythmic thump of the basketball was definitely a noise disturbance. Next, she found section 6.1a, common areas, including but not limited to streets, sidewalks, and cul-de-sacs, shall be kept free of obstructions at all times. The makeshift hoop attached to the lamppost, a clear violation. Finally, she reviewed section 8.3c, organized sporting activities are prohibited in residential areas without prior written approval from the HOA board. No doubt Michael hadn't sought prior approval. Brenda closed the rulebook with a satisfying thud. She had everything she needed. A sense of righteous purpose filled her. She wouldn't let one individual disrupt the tranquility and order of Willow Creek Estates. She had a duty, a responsibility, but as she stared out the window at the empty cul-de-sac, a strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered within her. It wasn't quite guilt, but something akin to it. A brief, unsettling awareness of the vast emptiness of her perfectly ordered life. She quickly pushed it away. Rules were rules, and rules were there for a reason. The confrontation. Brenda Abernathy marched toward the cul-de-sac, her sensible shoes clicking a staccato rhythm against the asphalt. The late afternoon sun beat down, but Brenda barely noticed. her focus laser-locked on the rhythmic thud of a basketball and the squeak of tires. Michael Rodriguez was at it again. She planted herself at the edge of his makeshift court, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disapproval. Michael dribbled the ball with practiced ease, his chair gliding back and forth as he sized up an imaginary opponent. He didn't seem to notice her at first, lost in the rhythm of his practice. "Michael!" Brenda's voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding. He stopped, the ball held securely in his lap. His dark eyes, usually bright with youthful enthusiasm, held a flicker of apprehension. "Hi, Mrs. Abernathy." Brenda tightened her grip on the clipboard she carried. "We need to talk about this activity." She gestured vaguely at the basketball hoop and the chalk lines marking his court. Michael sighed, a sound that was barely audible above the chirping of cricket starting their evening chorus. "Is it about the noise again? I'm trying to keep it down." Brenda's lips pursed. "The noise is a factor, yes, but it's primarily about adherence to community regulations." She flipped open the clipboard, the pages rustling in the slight breeze. Article 7, subsection B, paragraph 3, states clearly that recreational activities are not permitted in common areas, including cul-de-sacs, that impede vehicular traffic or pedestrian access. Michael shifted in his chair. "But I'm not blocking anyone. The only time a car comes down here is when someone lives here, or a delivery, and I always stop when they need to get by. I can even move the hoop." He gestured to the portable basketball stand. Brenda raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "That's not the point, Michael. The point is that rules are rules. This isn't a designated recreational area. It's a residential street, and frankly," she lowered her voice slightly, "it's also a safety hazard. What if a child were to run out into the street, or a car failed to see you?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I'm always careful, Mrs. Abernathy, and this is the only place I can practice. The park doesn't have a basketball court, and the school gym is only available during school hours. I'm trying out for the regional team, and I need to practice." He looked at her, a plea in his eyes. "This is really important to me." Brenda felt a twinge, a minuscule prick of guilt that she quickly suppressed. She had a schedule to keep, and the pristine order of the neighborhood was paramount. Besides, Michael was a perfectly nice young man, so if she let it slide for him, she would have to let it slide for everyone. "I understand your ambition, Michael, but that doesn't supersede the bylaws. You need to find another place to practice." She tapped the clipboard authoritatively. "But where?" Michael asked, his voice laced with frustration. "Where else can I go?" Brenda shrugged, a gesture that was meant to convey sympathy but came across as dismissive. "That's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to ensure that everyone adheres to the community guidelines, perhaps the YMCA. The YMCA is 20 miles away, and my mom works 2 jobs. She can't always drive me." Brenda sighed dramatically. This was becoming tiresome. "Michael, I'm not unsympathetic, but I'm also not willing to overlook a blatant violation of the HOA agreement. If this continues, I'll be forced to file a formal complaint." Michael's shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of him. "The complaint?" Brenda nodded grimly. "Which could result in fines. I really don't want to do that, Michael. Please, find another place to practice." She gave him a tight, insincere smile. "Have a good evening." She turned and walked away, the sound of her shoes fading into the quiet hum of suburban life. As she reached her perfectly manicured lawn, she glanced back. Michael was still sitting in his chair, the basketball motionless in his lap, his head bowed. Brenda felt another flicker, a tiny ember of doubt that she quickly stamped out. She was doing what was right. She had to. Back in the cul-de-sac, Michael stared at the asphalt, the chalk lines blurring in his vision. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and despair. The tryouts were next week. How was he supposed to improve if he couldn't even practice? He gripped the basketball tighter, the leather worn smooth from hours of use. The desire to play, to prove himself, burned brighter than ever, a defiant spark refusing to be extinguished. Limited practice. The tires of his chair rasped a quicker beat against the pavement. Michael spun around, retrieved the orange sphere, a gift from Sarah, still bearing the scent of new rubber, and began his drills. 3 rhythmic thuds, then a launch toward the elevated ring he'd somehow managed to defend from neighborhood ire. A clank of metal. Another miss. Disappointment clenched his insides as he snagged the rebound. 20 minutes. A meager allowance, dictated by the ticking clock and the looming specter of Mrs. Davison's disapproval, a shadow soon to darken the driveway with recycled complaints and laminated regulations, barely enough to loosen his muscles, let alone hone his skills. He tried again, mindful of each movement, the bend of his elbow, the trajectory from his wrist, the tactile reassurance of the ball through his worn gloves. Clang. A curse escaped his lips, a frosty plume in the frigid air. He hurled the ball in frustration, a wayward missile careening off course, bouncing down the asphalt incline. Michael! Sarah's voice drifted from the porch. He ignored her summons, chasing after the runaway ball, jaw tight. He felt the weight of her observation, a silent current of concern washing over him. Ball in hand, he paused. Time was running out. To quit felt like a surrender he couldn't stomach, even temporarily. He returned to the makeshift free throw line, squared his shoulders, and released. The ball bounced mockingly off the rim. He let it spin away, leaning his head against the cold steel of his chair. He was destined to be a disaster at tryouts. An abject, humiliating failure. He could almost hear the coach's sigh of exasperation, see the pitying glances exchanged between teammates. The back door hinges groaned, and Sarah appeared, cradling a steaming mug. She halted a few feet away, extending the peace offering. Hot chocolate. Thought you could use some. He accepted the warmth, his numb fingers thawing slowly. He avoided her gaze. It's hopeless, Mom. I can't get any real practice. I'm going to be the worst player there. Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes level with his. Hey, don't say that. You're pushing yourself harder than anyone. You're navigating hurdles no one else even sees. Yeah, well, that doesn't guarantee I can sink a basket, he muttered, swirling the sugary brew. It smelled of marshmallows and broken dreams. Maybe not, she conceded gently. But it reveals something else. Michael. It showcases resilience. It highlights determination, and those qualities carry just as much weight as a perfect shot. He finally met her eyes, their edges raw with vulnerability. But what if it's not enough? What if they only see a player out of practice, unable to compete? Sarah squeezed his hand. Then we'll brainstorm a new approach. We always do, right? Perhaps we can scout out an indoor facility, rent it for an hour each week. Or convince Mr. Henderson at the community center to grant you access to the gym during off-peak hours. He shook his head, a tremor of worry in his voice. We can't afford that. We'll manage, she affirmed, her voice resolute. Don't fret about that now. Just concentrate on what lies within your control. Focus on these precious minutes, extracting every ounce of potential from each attempt, and remember that I'm your unwavering ally, always. He took a cautious sip of the hot chocolate. The sweetness was a balm, a pocket of comfort against the encroaching tide of anxiety. He knew the truth in her words, at least in part. He refused to allow Mrs. Davison, or the HOA's draconian rules, or the paralyzing fear of inadequacy to triumph. He owed it to himself, and to Sarah, to persevere. But the knot of apprehension lingered, a persistent reminder of the limited time, the restricted practice, and the looming evaluation. He handed the mug back, a spark of renewed resolve igniting in his eyes. Okay, he affirmed. Let's get back to it. Mother's plea. Brenda Abernathy was among her prize roses when Sarah found her, each bloom a velvety beacon of crimson, heavy with cloying fragrance. The manicured lawn was immaculate. Sarah inhaled deeply, the floral sweetness doing little to soothe her jangled nerves. Brenda, a quick word? Brenda snipped a spent blossom, the sharp tick of the shears puncturing the tranquil air. Turning, she wore an expression of carefully manufactured solicitude. Sarah, of course. Is everything all right? It was a question layered with a saccharine insincerity that set Sarah's teeth on edge. It's Michael. Sarah plunged in the basketball that concerns. Brenda's meticulously sculpted brows arched almost imperceptibly. The covenants are quite clear. Sarah. No recreational activities that disrupt pedestrian access or generate undue noise. She made a sweeping gesture with the clippers. It's for the collective good, you realize. Sarah persisted, striving for a controlled, level tone. But Brenda, their asterisk is asterisk no pedestrian access to disrupt. It's a cul-de-sac, and the noise, the whisper of tires, the soft thump of a ball, hardly a cacophony. A wince betrayed her as she heard the pleading note in her voice. This isn't just a game for him. It's therapy, physical activity, it's his lifeline right now. Brenda's face remained an unreadable mask. I empathize, truly. However, I have a responsibility to uphold the regulations. Were I to grant Michael an exception, where would it cease? Soon, every resident would demand preferential treatment. She severed another rose, a particularly vibrant specimen, placing it carefully in her wicker basket. The HOA's purpose is to maintain order and enhance property values. I'm simply fulfilling my obligations. Frustration surged through Sarah. Is there absolutely no room for understanding? Brenda's smile never reached her eyes. Understanding doesn't maintain property values, Sarah. Adherence to our community's standards does. The HOA meeting felt akin to entering a gladiatorial arena, stale coffee mingled with an atmosphere of disapproval in the stifling community center air. Palms slick with perspiration, Sarah stood before the gathered homeowners and presented her plea. She spoke of Michael's commitment, his challenges, and the therapeutic value of his basketball sessions. She stressed the location, the almost deserted cul-de-sac, creating no actual disturbance. At the head table, Brenda sat, a formidable monolith, her countenance inscrutable. When Sarah concluded, a woman with a rigidly coiled bun and a cardigan seemingly borrowed from a giant spoke. What about the children playing? They can't play safely with a basketball careening around. Another voice piped up. And the racket? We all labor diligently. We deserve tranquility in our own residencies. Sarah attempted to counter, to clarify that Michael was conscientious, the sound barely noticeable, but her voice was drowned by a rising tide of objections. Finally, Mr. Peterson, a retired history instructor and a generally respected voice within the community, raised his hand. A tendril of hope unfurled within Sarah. Mr. Peterson always struck her as judicious, fair-minded. I appreciate Sarah's concerns, he began, his tone measured and considered. And I commend Michael's spirit, nevertheless. He paused, surveying the room. Nevertheless, the rules exist for a purpose, and while I feel for Michael's circumstances, we cannot simply waive those rules. He cleared his throat. Perhaps Michael could identify an alternate practice location. The park boasts a basketball court, though it is less than ideal. Sarah's heart plummeted. The park's surface was fractured and uneven, perilous for Michael's wheelchair, and it was a bus ride distant, a logistical nightmare without assistance. Brenda cleared her throat, the sound crisp and final. Thank you, Harold. Asi stated, we must preserve the regulations. She fixed Sarah with a direct, unyielding gaze. I am certain Michael can discover other solutions. A motion was made to uphold the existing HOA statutes concerning noise and recreational activities in residential zones. A vote ensued. The outcome was overwhelmingly in support of enforcement. Sarah stood, defeated, the collective censure of the community weighing down on her. She met Mr. Peterson's gaze. He offered a small, apologetic smile, but it did little to alleviate the pain. As she exited the community center, the receding hum of voices trailing behind her, a wave of fierce anger washed over her. She wouldn't concede, and not yet. Michael deserved advocacy. She merely needed to devise a strategy of fighting back. This is beyond the pale, Michael fumed, the basketball ticking rhythmically against the garage floor. As he spun it, he navigated his wheelchair around the cramped space, dodging stacks of canvases. I can't even bounce a ball without risking legal action. What am I supposed to do, exactly? Emily's laptop snapped shut, the sound sharp against the backdrop of the cluttered garage. Paint cans, discarded and half empty, huddled along one wall, brushes suspended in cloudy water. The air carried a sharp tang of turpentine and the ghost of unrealized masterpieces. She vaulted off her stool, her gaze flashing. Absolutely not. We're not letting this HOA, this bureaucratic monstrosity, win. Michael stilled the spinning ball. Monstrosity? Think multi-headed beast. You chop one down, two more sprout. That's how these things operate. They'll bleed you dry if you give them an opportunity. She began to prowl, her restless energy filling the compact space. Right, strategy session, operation, reclaim the dribble. First, we need allies. We have to show people this isn't just some kid bouncing a ball, it's about. She trailed off, snapping her fingers. Access, possibility, triumph over hardship. We need to frame this, Michael. Frame it? He slumped slightly. I just want to practice. Precisely, but you practice with purpose, as a symbol of something larger. You're not simply a guy shooting hoops, you're an emblem of resilience. We need to get that message out. Emily seized a whiteboard leaning precariously against the wall, attacking it with a dry erase marker. Okay, options. Point 1, public display. We rally the neighborhood, you demonstrate your skills, we shout slogans and maybe a touch of performative art. Too much. Michael grimaced. Way too much. My mom would ground me for life. Okay, scratch the performance art. Option 2, media outreach. We spread your story far and wide. Local news outlet. Teen athlete fights back against red tape. HOA crushes wheelchair basketball dreams. Something with punch. He massaged his forehead. I don't know, all I want is to play. Dealing with reporters sounds draining. I get it, but think about the leverage. An article puts them on the defensive, exposes their pettiness. It's like holding a magnifying glass to their absurdity. Emily snatched a small, battered camera from a shelf. And a video, concise, impactful. You practicing, looking determined, maybe a touch of wistful reflection. We upload it, make it go viral. Let Michael dribble. She punched the air. Michael watched her, a slow grin tugging at his lips. Emily's zeal was contagious, even if her plans bordered on outlandish. A video, hey, I suppose I could manage that. Brilliant, and I'll assist. I can edit. We'll incorporate music, dramatic slow-motion sequences. It'll be legendary. She snatched his basketball. Okay, lens test. Show me your most formidable game face. He chuckled, the sound lighter than it had been all day. Seriously, game face for a camera test? Nevertheless, he positioned himself, focusing on the hoop Emily had rigged up years earlier, a childish trinket now ridiculously small. Drawing a deep breath, he dribbled the ball and sent it soaring. It sliced cleanly through the net. Magnificent. See, you're a natural. Okay, filming tomorrow. We'll capture footage of you in the cul-de-sac, perhaps even artfully framed shots of that ridiculous HOA regulation. They'll rue the day they ever bothered you. As Emily spun fantasies of camera angles and soundtracks, Michael felt a spark of optimism flicker within him. He wasn't merely fighting for his own right to play. He was fighting alongside Emily, buoyed by her unyielding support and boundless vitality, and perhaps, just perhaps, they stood a chance. The cul-de-sac and the game weren't lost yet. Going viral. Michael dribbled, the rhythmic thump of the ball a temporary balm to his frustration. Okay, are you ready? He glanced at Emily, who was perched precariously on the edge of the cul-de-sac's curb, phone held high. Ready, Freddy, she chirped, her voice brimming with an energy that always seemed to defy gravity. Show them what you got, Rodriguez. He took a deep breath, focusing. This wasn't just practice, this was a statement. He weaved the chair through a makeshift obstacle course of cones, his arms burning, his core engaged. He executed a perfect spin, the wheels a blur against the asphalt. Finally, he launched the ball, sinking a basket with a satisfying asterisk thwack star. Yes! Emily yelled, scrambling down from the curb. That was amazing. We have to get more angles, more emotion. Think, underdog montage. Michael chuckled, despite himself. Underdog montage, really? Seriously, we need to sell this. Think inspirational, think Hoosiers but with wheels. She grabbed the phone, reviewing the footage. Okay, we need a close-up of your face when you're shooting. The determination, the sweat, the suffering. He rolled his eyes, but a grin tugged at his lips. Emily's enthusiasm was infectious, even when it was ridiculous. They spent the next hour filming, refilming, and tweaking every shot. Michael pushed himself, fueled by a potent mix of anger and hope. Later that evening, Emily sat hunched over her laptop, bathed in the glow of the screen. Michael watched from the doorway as she spliced clips, adjusted the lighting, and added a soundtrack. He recognized the swelling strings of an instrumental piece. Something vaguely epic. Seriously, he asked, trying to keep a straight face. Are you adding movie trailer music? She didn't look up. It's called creating atmosphere, Michael. It's about telling a story, and our story needs drama. The final product was something Michael had to admit. Emily had a knack for this. The video was raw, but powerful. It showed him practicing, interspersed with shots of the no basketball playing sign, and a brief, blurry clip of Brenda Abernathy pointing a finger and shaking her head. The music swelled at key moments, culminating in a triumphant crescendo as he sunk the final basket. They sent the video to the local news station. They didn't expect much. The next morning, Emily sent him a link. Check this out. It was an article on the Pine Ridge Gazette website. The headline screamed, HOA rules prevent teen wheelchair basketball star from practicing. Below was a picture of Michael in his chair, mid-dribble. He began to read, his heart pounding. The article detailed the situation, quoting Brenda's justification of the rules and highlighting Michael's aspirations. It even included a link to Emily's video. The comments section was a battlefield. Within hours, the article was shared hundreds of times on social media, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The video went viral. Let Michael play trended on Twitter. Local news outlets picked up the story, then national ones. The comments ranged from supportive, "This is ridiculous, let the kid play," to outraged, "Brenda Abernathy is a heartless tyrant." There were memes mocking the HOA rules, and even a few calling for Brenda's resignation. "This is insane," Michael said, scrolling through the endless stream of comments. Emily, bouncing on the balls of her feet, could barely contain herself. I told you it would work. We have to keep the momentum going. Retweet, share, engage." Brenda Abernathy, meanwhile, was not having a good day. Her phone rang incessantly. Her email inbox overflowed with angry messages. Her Facebook page was flooded with negative reviews. She locked herself inside her house, drawing the curtains, the digital pitchforks and torches burning brightly outside her door. The carefully manicured serenity of Pine Ridge Estates had been shattered, replaced by the deafening roar of public opinion. And it was all because of a basketball, a teenager, and a video. Gone viral, the HOA meeting. The rec center pulsed with suppressed outrage. Brenda Abernathy, perched uncomfortably on the folding chair behind the hastily arranged dais, felt the communal glare like a tangible force pressing down on her. The internet had been brutal, HOAzilla, heartless, Brenda the bully, but this felt far more personal. This was a room teeming with familiar faces, people she'd chatted with at block parties, shared holiday cheer with. Now, their expressions ranged from crestfallen to openly antagonistic. She attempted to clear her throat, the microphone transforming the sound into a jarring screech. Several attendees flinched. "Good evening, thank you all for attending this urgent HOA meeting. As we all know." A resonant voice thundered from the rear. "As we know, you tried to strangle a kid's passion, Brenda." Brenda recoiled. Mrs. Davison, whose award-winning roses Brenda had once complimented, had delivered the barb. A ripple of agreement spread through the gathering, a low swell of discontent. Brenda clutched the table's edge. "The regulations exist for a purpose, Mrs. Davison. I was merely adhering." Adhering to what, Brenda? Sarah Rodriguez's voice sliced through the din, sharp and resolute. Standing near the front, her face mirrored a deep-seated weariness Brenda had never witnessed. Beside her, Michael propelled his wheelchair forward, his expression a complex tapestry of frustration and anticipation. Adhering to the right to stifle potential, to penalize a child for daring to aim high? Brenda's carefully rehearsed arguments dissipated like smoke. It concerned safety, Sarah, the decibel level, the potential for property damage. Sarah advanced, her eyes ablaze. "Damage, Michael exercises more caution on that court than anyone. He respects this neighborhood. He respects boundaries, but you didn't respect him, Brenda. You couldn't even be bothered to speak with him." She indicated Michael with a sweep of her hand. "Observe him. He labors harder than anyone I know. He possesses more resilience in his smallest finger than most people exhibit in their entire person." A murmur of accord rippled through the room. Brenda felt a slick of sweat trickle down her temple. She desperately searched the assembly for a sympathetic expression, someone who understood the necessity for order, for rules. Mr. Harold Peterson, usually a quiet presence at HOA gatherings, his voice a gentle murmur of reason, slowly pushed himself upright. He adjusted his spectacles, his gaze unflinching. "Brenda," he declared, his voice surprisingly forceful, "I've been a resident of this community for 3 decades. I've watched children grow, pursuing every conceivable aspiration. I've always felt it was our duty to nurture them, not suppress them." He paused, his eyes softening as he regarded Michael. "This young man is an inspiration. His causing no harm. His bettering himself, and by doing so, his enriching our community." Brenda's meticulously crafted defense imploded. She glanced from Sarah to Michael to Mr. Peterson, then back at the multitude of faces, each reflecting profound disappointment. The air hung heavy, almost unbearable. "The rules are the rules," she muttered, the justification ringing hollow even to her. "Rules should serve the people, not the reverse," someone shouted from the fringes of the crowd. Sarah approached Michael and rested her hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity. "Michael isn't demanding preferential treatment, Brenda. He's requesting a chance. A chance to prove his worth. A chance to chase his dream." Brenda scrutinized Michael, truly observed him. She saw the grit etched onto his features, the fervent spark in his eyes. She saw not a disruption, but a young man driven by a purpose, a young man striving harder than most to realize it, and she comprehended, with a jolting realization, that she had nearly extinguished that inner flame the digital denigration had stung. But the true torment lay in witnessing the disillusionment in her neighbor's gazes, in Sarah's just indignation, and the resolute hope radiating from Michael. A wave of queasiness enveloped her. She shoved away from the table, her legs unsteady. She stammered, her voice a mere thread of sound. I require a moment. She spun and bolted, the weight of the room scorn pressing against her back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the rec center seemed to amplify her mortification, transforming the familiar space into a stark and unforgiving landscape. The online clamor had exacerbated the discord, but this was tangible: the faces, the resentment, the palpable shift in her neighbor's perceptions of her. The HOA regulation seemed like flimsy, irrelevant armor against the mounting tide of her own remorse. A change of heart. Brenda Abernathy's knuckles whitened as she neared the Rodriguez home. The azaleas, usually a source of neighborhood pride, now seemed to taunt her with their flamboyant color, a gaudy contrast to her own diminished standing. She could still feel the collective gaze of the HOA board during the last meeting, each stare a brand on her conscience. Sarah Rodriguez's icy anger had been preferable to the muted disappointment radiating from Mrs. Henderson, who celebrated petunias Brenda had long coveted. Drawing a steadying breath, Brenda shifted the casserole dish in her hands, a culinary olive branch. Though she doubted its power, the savory scent of bubbling cheese and chicken did little to calm her frayed nerves. The doorbell's peal amplified the turmoil within. Sarah answered, her face a carefully composed study in polite distance. Brenda, she acknowledged, her tone flat. Sarah, I brought this chicken and rice. I know Michael enjoys it. Brenda extended the dish, inwardly cringing at her awkwardness. Sarah hesitated, then accepted the offering. Thank you. She retreated slightly, gesturing inward. Come in. Michael was in the living room, navigating his wheelchair around a small net attached to a chair as he practiced basketball. The steady thump of the ball against the wall punctuated the air. He stilled his movements, his gaze meeting Brenda's with an expression she couldn't decipher. Brenda's rehearsed apology vanished. Michael, she blurted, I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I was mistaken about the basketball, about everything. The words felt flimsy, inadequate against the gravity of her actions. Michael remained impassive, his eyes unwavering. The silence grew, heavy and oppressive. At last, Sarah interjected, he's been working relentlessly. Brenda, this team means the world to him. Brenda nodded somberly. I realize that now, Anne. I understand I almost robbed him of that. She turned her gaze back to Michael, meeting his. I'm truly sorry. Michael pivoted his chair, bouncing the ball once before looking up. It's okay, Mrs. Abernathy, he replied, his voice surprisingly gentle. Just, don't let it happen again. The HOA meeting the following week was transformed. The atmosphere buzzed, not with hostility, but with purpose. Even ancient Mr. Peterson, typically dozing halfway through the agenda, sat bolt upright, his hearing aid cranked to maximum volume. The vote to revise the noise regulations to accommodate reasonable athletic practice was unanimous. Brenda added her yes, the word catching in her throat like a dry pill. Michael resumed his practice with renewed zeal. The cul-de-sac, once a site of conflict, became his arena. The rhythmic drumming of the basketball, the squeal of his tires, the determined breaths, these were the sounds of ambition, of dreams taking shape. Sarah watched him from the porch, a subtle smile gracing her lips. Then came the news. The email arrived late one evening, its subject line sending Sarah's pulse racing, regional team selections. Michael had made the cut. His name stood on the list, alongside other promising young athletes from across the state. A whoop of pure joy erupted from him, sending his wheelchair spinning in a victory lap. Sarah enveloped him in an embrace, tears stinging her eyes. The first regional game arrived swiftly. Sarah, Michael's staunchest supporter, had secured her spot in the stands early, but Michael was surprised to find Brenda Abernathy volunteering at the refreshment stand. She sported a cheerful yellow t-shirt emblazoned with regional wheelchair basketball volunteers, and a hesitant smile touched her face as she dispensed popcorn and drinks. Their eyes connected. Good luck, Michael, Brenda offered, her voice sincere. I'm cheering for you. Michael grinned, genuinely taken aback. Thanks, Mrs. Abernathy, that means a lot. As he wheeled onto the court, the cheers of the crowd receded into a dull roar. All that mattered was the game, the ball, the basket. He dribbled, passed, scored. The match dissolved into a whirlwind of movement, strategy, and collaboration. He played with an intensity that astonished even himself. He could hear Sarah's shouts from the bleachers and, he thought, perhaps, caught a fleeting glimpse of yellow as Brenda assisted another customer. Whether her support was genuine or not was irrelevant. What mattered was that he was playing, he was competing, he was living his passion. The burden on his shoulders, the weight of expectation and self-doubt, seemed to evaporate with each basket he made. He felt liberated.